Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Julian Sancton. He's a journalist and a writer, and he's the author of Madhouse at the End of the Earth. So welcome, Julian, to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. I first got the idea, that was 2015. I didn't get the contract for it until 2018. So I wrote it in earnest. It took me about 2.5 years. But the research took about a year, both rummaging through archives in all over the world, really. Norway, because there were Norwegian sailors on this ship, even though it was a Belgian expedition. There were half of the sailors were Norwegian, including a very famous Norwegian named Roald Amundsen, but we'll get to that.
We'll come to him, yeah.
Yeah, and so, because of that, he's such a national hero in Norway. His participation in the Belgica meant that there were plenty of archives related to that in Norway. So I went there. I went to Brussels, Antwerp, which is where the ship left in 1897 for Antarctica. They still have plenty of material there. And then the family in Ghent, or just outside Ghent, the estate of the descendants of Adrien de Gerlache, who was the commander of the Belgica and the men who originated this expedition. And then Library of Congress as well had a tremendous amount of documents related to Frederick Cook, who was the American ship's surgeon on board, and just a larger than life character, if you'll allow me the cliche. He's remembered, if he's remembered at all, for today for being the man who lied about getting to the North Pole in 1908, and was.
I'm reading your book, and we'll come to this, but it just seemed desperately unfair because he seems almost to be as much a leader of the expedition as anyone else. And if he had not been there, one wonders what.
Oh, they'd all be dead for sure.
Yeah.
He's that's what I loved that's what drew me to the idea. Is when I first read about it, just a few paragraphs in a magazine article, I was struck by two things. One was the very gothic image of people losing their minds in the poles. It reminded me of Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley. Just 19th century literature just drew a connection between the furthest recesses of the mind and the highest latitudes of Earth, as if there was some kind of malevolent force that make people go mad. So I just thought that was such a striking image. And then the role played by Frederick Cook, who was a man who's so maligned later in life, and that this anti-hero should be the hero of this expedition. That was also something that was extremely compelling and made me think that even though I was not necessarily a polar obsessive, that there was a great story here, driven by some pretty great characters.
Okay, so let's just start at the start, maybe.
Yeah.
And as you say, we're talking about an expedition that sets out in 1897, I think.
Yep.
To explore Antarctica. So can you just say something about the leader and where he's going and why he's going?
Yeah. His name was Adrien de Gerlache. He was a Belgian aristocrat, one of very few truly gifted sailors in Belgium. Belgium did not have much of a maritime tradition at that time. After the split with the Netherlands in 1830, the Netherlands basically took on the maritime responsibility for the region, and so Belgium was a bit of an embarrassment for the king and for Adrien de Gerlache to have this passion of the sea, and to dream of being an ocean-going explorer was quite unusual. But at the same time, in the mid-1890s, there was an agreement among all the geographic societies of the world that the Antarctic was the utmost priority, that it needed to be. It had been 50 years since the last serious expedition, which was James Clark Ross's in the 1840s, and it was high time that a serious scientific expedition go to the Antarctic. And so, of all of the countries that were aware that this was a priority. The one and the one explorer that goes is a guy from Belgium of all places, and a guy with very little experience. I mean, he was even though he was the highest prospect in Belgian sailing, he was essentially running a ferry service from I believe it was Antwerp to Dover. And so it was not really, it wasn't the first guy you'd imagine would run an extremely daring and high profile expedition like this. But he managed to get the scientific establishment behind him, managed to get the people of Belgium behind him, thanks to a subscription effort where one mailman contributed 1 franc, one senator contributed 3,000 francs, and ultimately he was able to raise about half the very meager budget from this, and then the government was sort of embarrassed into contributing the second half. And so then what he wasn't able to do was get enough Belgian sailors to man his ship, because, as I said, they weren't really a seagoing people. And what he was able to scrape together was not the cream of the crop. They were basically a notch below pirates in terms of their disposition. So then it became sort of international by default. And then he brought the scientists came from Eastern Europe. And then at the very last moment, he hired an American, which was one of his rare good staffing decisions.
When I was looking at this, I mean, Belgium, you immediately think of Tintin.
Oh, of course.
He's the most famous Belgian.
Yeah.
But there is a sort of a Tintin-esque flavour to this whole expedition somehow. You've got Professor Calculus down there in the hold, and you have the captain, who actually is pretty sound, but nonetheless, there is just that slight flavour to it.
Oh yeah, well I have the Tintin rocket ship on my desk, as inspiration. No, you're very right. And I grew up in France. And the sort of European comics tradition was at the forefront of my mind. That's those stuff of my boyish dreams was inspired by those comics. So there's definitely a lot of that.
I do wonder if Hergé might have been somewhat influenced by these kind of expeditions. Although I know, I was trying to work out where Tintin had been, and he's never been to the North Pole, and he's never been to the South Pole.
It's very funny you should say that, because the Hergé was became very friendly with the descendants of de Gerlache, and his Adrien de Gerlache. You're the first person to bring up this connection, but Adrien de Gerlache, his son, named Gaston de Gerlache, was also an Antarctic explorer, and during the International Geophysical Year in 1857, he organized a Belgian expedition. There was a plane on board, and the tail of the plane was designed by Hergé. The logo of the expedition was designed by Hergé. So you're quite right that that Tintin would have loved to be there, and in a manner of speaking, he was.
Which character would he have been, I wonder? Oh,
I don't know. I think he would have been one of the resourceful ones. I think he would have been very Cook-like, although I don't think he's not a liar. Cook had a very sort of ambiguous relationship with the truth.
Mm. One of the great things about the expedition, I thought, is that everybody keeps a diary.
Not everybody, but very close to. It was a historian's dream. I thought one of the reasons this story hadn't been properly told in a book was that maybe the historical record was poor, that there was just not much to draw on. And, however exciting an expedition is, if there's only one perspective related, or if we only hear from secondhand sources, it's never going to be satisfying. I wanted to get in these guys' heads, and so the only way to do that is to draw from a multiplicity of records. And it turns out that of the 19 guys who left South America aboard the Belgica and arrived in Antarctica, about a dozen kept some kind of detailed day-to-day account.
That's extremely lucky that you got so many, because it allows you to cross-check a little bit, because, of course, everybody's slightly partial in their own diary.
Yeah, that's a problem in any exactly. That's a problem in any circumstance, but especially when you have a man on board who's renowned for being a bit of a con artist. It turns out that in Belgica, his account was, at that time he was quite reliable, and everybody's he was the first. Frederick Cook was the first to publish his diary. That went against convention. Actually, usually the expedition leader would have that prerogative, but Cook took it upon himself to publish a book called Through the First Antarctic Night, which is a remarkable book. No one ever contradicted his version of events until much later. There was when the North Pole scandal happened, when he lied about that. Then some people started to say, well, we saw it coming. We knew he wasn't really that reliable. But they all recognized that they owed their lives to his interventions.
Let's just talk about the journey south,
Yeah.
because you say that the crew of Belgians, because
Yeah.
they got Norwegian crew
Yeah.
and they've got Belgian crew, and on the whole, the Norwegians are altogether rather more professional bunch. So could you just talk a little bit about the pretty unsatisfactory journey that they had before they finally set out to the south?
There were ethnic rifts and sort of nationalistic rifts among the crew that divided Norwegians and Belgians, and even the French-speaking Belgians from the Dutch-speaking Belgians. And so it was really not exactly a melting pot. It was more of a tinderbox. And on the way down, the Norwegians were they had experience with the Arctic, a lot of them, and they were more disciplined. That's true. And I think one of the reasons the Belgians weren't as disciplined is because they felt that they were somehow more, more entitled because it was a nationalistic endeavor, and so they thought that they had more of a right to be there. So for de Gerlache, though, they were all on the same level, and that just didn't really work. But so there were rifts. At one point, the addition of alcohol became the match to the tinderbox, and when they moored out in the port of Montevideo, there was an incident where they all got absolutely hammered, and there was just a brawl, a massive brawl that they beat the hell out of the cook, who was French, and so they figured they couldn't. The Norwegians and the Belgians were evenly matched, and so they decided to take it out on the cook, and who was French, and he got kicked off the ship. But that was only a harbinger of things to come. De Gerlache was not able. He was not a natural disciplinarian. He was many things, but he was not that. He was a good sailor, but he had better command of ships than of men. And in Punta Arenas in Chile, the Belgian sailors particularly, ran roughshod over him. They disobeyed orders. They overstayed their shore leave. They drank to their heart's content and painted the town red. Already a town very famous for its alcohol intake. Cook would said people would drink in church and not just at communion.
And I can't pronounce the name properly, what can de Gerlache do about this?
Well, he could have done other things. He could have disciplined them. He could have withheld wages, but he felt that his hands were tied, partly because since it wasn't a military ship, he couldn't put him in shackles. It was technically a steam yacht with the burgee of the yacht club of Antwerp. So he didn't really exactly have a mandate to put people in to imprison or put his sailors in shackles. So he felt the only thing he could do is withhold wages or to kick them off the ship. But he was reluctant to do that because since they were Belgian, he figured that by throwing off Belgians and altering the balance of Belgians on the ship, that he would be compromising its nationalistic quality. And so what he was terrified of was that the Belgian press would turn on him. He was more afraid of that than of the dangers of the Antarctic, strangely. And so the Belgians knew this, and they basically shook him down for money and stared him down. When at first he relented, his authority had just vanished. So they realized they could do whatever they wanted. So that came to a head in December of 1897, and mutiny came very close. Basically, he was held at gunpoint, and it was only by raising a literal red flag and calling for the assistance of the Chilean Port Authority and Navy that these Belgians were frog marched off the ship. And he was so this detail just kills me. He was so worried about what they would say to the Belgian press that even though they had almost mutinied, he gave them each £1 sterling on their way out effectively buying their silence, but it didn't work because his fears did come true. One guy got home, and by this point, by the time he spoke to the Belgian press, the Belgica hadn't been heard from for months, and people thought it might have been lost. And so he said, "Oh well, yeah, de Gerlache, indeed, he kicked all the Belgians off," which was not true. He had kicked, 4 of them off. There were still plenty left, but he was just bad mouthing him to anyone who would listen to him. And so that was at the forefront of his mind, and also his de Gerlache's fear of what people would think of him back home also dictated what I would say is a much more consequential decision, which is to sail into the pack ice as it was solidifying in the Bellingshausen Sea.
And the problem there is that they arrive too late, don't they? They get out of sync.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, there were two, and I would say incompatible goals to this expedition. One was to run a very thorough scientific program along the Antarctic Peninsula. The other was something that I guess was more understandable to the general public and more electrifying, which was to reach the South Magnetic Pole, which is it's different from the geographic pole, which is what we all think of when we think of the South Pole. The South Magnetic Pole is a center of magnetic activity. It's not at the geographic pole at all. It's in constant movement, and even though people had a vague sense of where it was, it had never been reached. And I guess it's somewhat important for navigation and correcting charts and just for navigation purposes, it's an important thing to have. But it's also just a great goal. It sounds to reach that after both an overland journey and a long maritime journey, it would have been something to crow about. However, to reach the magnetic pole on the other end of Antarctica, it's south of Australia, would require, before the winter ice set in, would require the men to go as fast as possible. And the other goal of running a thorough scientific program would require the scientists taking their time. So those didn't work out. And because de Gerlache indulged the scientist's curiosity for so long, he lost some time. The mutiny lost time. There was a grounding. They ran aground in the Beagle Channel in Tierra del Fuego, and they lost a few days there. And so by the time he set out for Victoria Land, which is where the magnetic pole was presumed to be, the ice would have been too thick. He wouldn't have gotten there. So during a storm where the winter ice had started shattering, and temporarily, but it gave him an opportunity, de Gerlache thought it was to either turn back, and he did have a thorough scientific bounty to bring home, and it would have been interesting for the scientists, but perhaps not for the press or for the public. And so either he turns back somewhat empty-handed, or he sails the ship into the ice, and even though he wouldn't reach the magnetic pole, he would reach some other kind of record, which was he and his men would become the first to endure a winter in the Antarctic, if, of course, they survived, which is a huge if.
Right, because quite a lot of ships, when they go into the Arctic ice, they get crushed.
In the Arctic ice, yeah. He was very familiar with the history of the Franklin expedition, for example, which was caught in the ice and no one survived, or the Jeannette expedition, just a few years before the Belgica. These were some horror stories. Ships, the pressures that ice can exert on ships can be enough to destroy them. As we know that, also that's happened with Shackleton about 15 years after the Belgica. And it's a fate that any explorer goes out of his way to avoid, and yet this is one that he almost invited.
Let's just talk a bit about Cook now, because I sort of feel this is one of his. Yeah, it's not a successful intervention, but he's dead against staying.
Dead against. They all are, except for de Gerlache, and then de Gerlache gets his captain to agree with him, but of course his captain's taking orders. Cook was the only one with any kind of experience wintering in the poles. He had been in the Arctic with Robert Peary, his who would become his arch rival later in life, but in the early 1890s he was a surgeon aboard an Arctic expedition, so he knew what to expect, except he was on land at that time. Here he would be at sea, which means that there would be, there would be no, you could trust the ground you walk on. And there would be no way to even theoretically walk to civilization. There would be no native people, as far as he knew. And it would altogether much more dangerous. And Cook advised against it, absolutely. He was dead against it. Cook was dead against it, and he got everybody else around him. He convinced everybody else, especially the scientists, that this was a fate to avoid, and they were terrified. The only person who was not terrified but excited was Roald Amundsen, who at that time was sort of forming himself into a polar explorer. He had dreamt since his adolescence of being a polar explorer in the vein of Franklin or of Fridtjof Nansen. And he had a masochistic streak. He figured if he was suffering, he was making progress towards that goal. So he was all for it.
Yeah, they've got these two giant personalities on the ship, Cook and Amundsen. And once they go south and it freezes in, Cook and Amundsen, they actually become incredibly close, don't they?
They do, yeah. Amundsen has a tremendous amount of respect for Cook, which I find poignant given, that Cook would end his life in jail and Amundsen would end up being probably the most celebrated polar explorer of all time. That Amundsen would be the apprentice to Cook, I thought was extremely poignant. But yeah, they formed a kind of a partnership. It's almost as if they recognized in each other a similar aptitude for this kind of stuff, for polar adventure. And so they would frequently go on excursions. They would stray far from the ship, which was extremely dangerous because the ice was in constant movement. And it is quite possible that if they came back and they might not find the ship, or if there was just a little bit of fog, they could walk 100 meters from the ship and not see it and drift away.
Yeah, the courage of these two, it almost seemed foolhardy, but they're the ones who've got initiative. They're the ones who are looking for problems to solve all the time.
Yeah.
And there's a sense that the other characters, and maybe this is coming from the diaries and maybe it's a little unfair, but there's just a sense of very active, inquiring minds in Cook and Amundsen, which you don't see so much in the others.
Yeah, there's one other guy named Georges Lecointe. He was the captain. He was 26 at the time and already a mathematical and navigational prodigy. He was absolutely suited for this stuff. He became one of the sickest men on board. There was a mysterious malady. In addition to scurvy, in addition to seasonal depression, they were all afflicted terribly by something that we still...
But can I just ask you about
Sure.
the scurvy? Because that makes no sense, right? Because you don't suffer from scurvy because we know what causes it and we know how to solve it. We use lemon juice.
Well, lemon juice was the first solution, I guess, discovered by James Lind as the most effective solution was fresh lemon juice. Of course, after 3 months, whatever fresh fruit they would have brought with them from their last port of call would have gone bad, and the vitamin would have disintegrated. There was another solution which they, as you suggest, would have adopted from the practices of the Royal Navy, which was bottled lime juice, which certainly, I guess keeps better, still tastes good, but the limes themselves have some anti-scorbutic power. But when when it's boiled to create this concentrate that the lime juice is made from, that destroys most of the vitamin C that would have been contained in it. Of course, they knew nothing about vitamin C then, but they knew that lime juice was, as de Gerlache says, lime juice is good enough for the Royal Navy. It's good enough for me. It was when Cook saw what he recognized as the symptoms of scurvy, he was surprised because scurvy, as you suggest, was thought to have been a disease of the past at that time, and yet the practice of relying on bottled lime juice and limes in general it hadn't been discovered that wasn't as effective, in part because ocean voyages had shortened thanks to the steam engine. And so they didn't have the opportunity until these polar expeditions started, testing that theory because they were locked away from any kind of fresh food for so long.
So what was Cook's solution to the scurvy problem?
It was brilliant. Part of it was just out of necessity. He realized, well, I know it's a nutritional problem because if we know that eating sauerkraut or lemon juice or a number of other foods, he didn't know what they all had in common, but that what they had in common is vitamin C, that eating those foods will reverse the symptoms of scurvy as surely as water douses fire. And so he knew it was a nutritional problem. And he also knew one other thing, that the Inuit, with whom he had had some experience in the Arctic, didn't suffer from scurvy. They suffered from other things during the winter, certainly from depression, and their diets weren't ideal, but they didn't suffer from scurvy. And so he figured there must be something in their diet of fresh meat and blubber that must ward off scurvy. And so just quite logically, he thought what is good for the Arctic is almost certainly good for the Antarctic. And he prescribed a diet of fresh penguin and seal meat to his men, to abandon the canned food they were relying on and to eat primarily penguin and seal. And it was quite a revolting meal for a lot of these people, particularly because the cook, they had kicked one cook off in Montevideo. One of the mutineers was another cook, and they kicked him off. Was the replacement cook, and so the third replacement cook was a cabin boy who was had no experience and didn't know what he was doing, but he was eager. And so as de Gelate said, he's incompetent, but worse still, he's ambitious. So he, in his hands, just a penguin steak was one of the most revolting things you could put in your mouth. However, of course, as I said, Amundsen equated suffering with progress, and so he loved it. He actually found it quite good. And those who resisted, who thought that what's good enough for the Navy is good enough for them, or that a Belgian doesn't eat penguin meat or what have you, or de Gerlache probably may have thought that his backers had paid for so much fine food and it would be a pity not to eat it. I don't understand exactly why he refused to eat it, but he did, and he became one of the sickest men on board. One thing I want to add. It has been suggested recently that a lot of the symptoms experienced by the men actually suggest that in addition to scurvy, they might have been suffering from another nutritional deficiency called beriberi disease, which is a lack of vitamin B1 or thiamine. This is something, for example, their legs would become paralyzed.
Does that happen to the captain?
It happens to the captain, yeah. And their erratic heart rates, disorientation, confusion. Those are things that can happen with scurvy, but it's much more likely with beriberi disease. And fortunately for the men in Cook's care, penguin meat, fresh meat in general, would also provide vitamin B1. So his intervention was still a successful one in that sense.
You said that there was another mysterious malady which went beyond scurvy.
Well, it could be beriberi disease, but it is also the level of what Cook called the cerebral symptoms, the mental symptoms, were something that no one could really account for. It could have been a question of mass hysteria. They all, all the men suffered to some extent from fear, from vertigo, from confusion, from short attention spans, from their irritability, but a few, went beyond the brink of insanity into madness, and it's unclear what caused that. Although I think we all, after having endured a year of lockdown, would have some idea. We were watching Netflix and cooking bread, but while they were avoiding scurvy and eating penguin, but. We have some idea of the stress that might have put them on, especially because there was, the hopelessness of being stuck in the ice, and with no prospect of breaking out of it. Surely got to them as well. So, but that there is still a mystery as to what was the force behind the madness.
I was quite interested in your theory that Cook, while he was developing his photographs, was inadvertently allowing dangerous chemicals to seep into de Gerlache's cabin.
I try to make very clear that this is just a theory, but I looked at the design of the ship. Cook's darkroom. He was also the official photographer of the expedition, and he developed photos in there constantly, and they're quite good. But the darkroom, looking at the blueprint of the ship, the only escape for any vapors in there, for any fumes coming from these baths for the development, would have been into de Gerlache's cabin. And after running out of hypo, which is a fixer for photos to just sort of set the image, he had remembered that he had what he had read in a British magazine that they had on board, which was that in the early days of daguerreotypes, they would use hydrocyanic acid, which is extremely toxic. It's happens to be the active ingredient in Zyklon B.
Gosh.
So they had some on board to kill specimens for the zoologist, and as Cook says, one drop in the tongue and they were done for. So you can imagine doing a whole bath of these things to put the glass plates in. Would have, he held his breath and he didn't stay in the dark room long, but these fumes, as I said, would have nowhere to escape except for de Gerlache's cabin. And de Gerlache was very sick from scurvy, and so he spent all of his time in there. So there is some possibility that because the effects of cyanide poisoning also account for many of the symptoms that the men were feeling: the heart rates, the confusion, the headaches. So it's something that I couldn't ignore, and it is quite a interesting thing to contemplate.
Well, Napoleon's supposed to be killed by his wallpaper, so...
Oh, really?
Well, apparently there's mercury in the wallpaper in St. Helena, so there's a theory that helped poison him inadvertently.
Well, he wasn't a young man either.
Well, indeed, it's not like for that time that he lived, he lived a reasonably full life, I guess. So,
yeah.
So I don't know. And then, of course, it's not just the men that suffer, is it? It's the ship's cat.
Yeah, the cat was, to some extent, the canary in the coal mine. They had two cats on board, named Nansen and Sverdrup, and named after the great Norwegian explorers. And within a week of leaving Antwerp, seasickness took hold in the Bay of Biscay in France. Seasickness took hold, and people were hurling over the gunwales and in the machine room and everywhere. It was a chaotic scene, and the captain was particularly affected. And when he saw Sverdrup doing his business on the poop deck, literally, he grabbed him by the nape of the neck and threw him overboard.
I've got to be honest, more than the death of some of the crew, that really shook me, because I felt it went to character, and yet LeConte is kind of one of the heroes of the story, but that really...
Well, he doesn't start off...
As a sentimentalist, maybe.
Yeah, well, certainly for the crew felt the same as you. When they saw that, it made an enemy of him. And one guy particularly, his name's Vinke, Carl August Vinke, he was Norwegian, was struck by this and felt very sentimental about the cat and ill-disposed from then on towards the captain. But Vinke is an early casualty of the expedition. He falls overboard during a storm near the South Shetland Islands before even making landfall. And this I found just chilling, that when he fell in, there were icebergs everywhere. The water was a few degrees above zero, and yet who jumps in after him to try to save him? LeConte, the guy the
guy who he sort of
maligned. And it was a heroic, ultimately unsuccessful attempt. But when I went to Antarctica to research, to get a sense of the environment, and I jumped into the water to see what it was like. And it was, it's not, you don't feel cold so much as a burning, numbing pain. And to think that I did this in very controlled conditions, and LeConte was doing this with icebergs all around him, with a ship rocking above his head.
But it was in the middle of a storm, right?
In the middle of a storm, yeah.
I thought that spoke well of de Gerlache's leadership qualities, is that he refuses to allow a boat to be launched because he doesn't want to risk 4 men for one. And I thought that's actually pretty sound thinking.
Absolutely. I don't think history can really judge him harshly for that. I think that's actually quite a sound decision. And that's his training, I'm sure.
Right.
It's a tough decision. But the Vinca was to some degree at fault. He hadn't he hadn't attached himself to the ship when he was trying to unclog one of the scuppers.
Right, and in fact, he's at fault doubly because he made a practice of not attaching himself, right?
Yeah, exactly, and defying Amundsen's orders. Amundsen was the first mate. So
Hmm.
as tragic as it is, he was beloved on board, but he thought it was, I guess, exciting and daring, and to go above and beyond and not affix himself.
There's another death, isn't there, when they're entombed in the ice?
There is, and this was one that struck de Gerlache particularly hard because it was his best friend, and he was the first person who signed on to the expedition, a man named Emile Danco, who had led a pretty coddled, cosseted life in Belgium, and was I believe one of the reasons is he had just had his heart broken, and he knew he had to go. He wanted to go somewhere to seek adventure after, and also his father had just died, and his father, even though Danko was in his late 20s, his father was still this tyrannical presence in his life. And as soon as his father died and he has this heartbreak, he wants to go out on an adventure. He looked like what square-jawed, matinee idol. But he actually had a kind of a frail constitution, and de Gerlache knew it. And so he reluctantly allowed him on board because Danko said, well, if I don't go to the Antarctic with you, I'll go to the Congo. And so he figured that the sterile, cold but sterile air of the Antarctic would be better. But in the end, the scurvy and the general despondency took hold of him, and this mysterious heart ailment, which would make all of them saw their heartbeats just vacillate extraordinarily from more than 100 beats per minute. But his heart was frail, and so he ultimately died of a heart attack.
And people reckon now that's probably Berry.
It could be, yeah. This is something I didn't get to in the book, and I'd read about it later. It's could be Berry. It could also be, Cook thought it had something to do with the lack of sunlight, and it's true that lack of sunlight does have physiological effects. Cook thought that his line is that without the sun, the heart acts like a ship without a governor. And there is another theory is that it's something called winter over syndrome, which is thought to be what affected the guys on the Belgica to a lesser extent affected other expeditions later on. And one of the theories, as I say, is winter over syndrome, which is a hormonal imbalance. Thyroid T3 hormone, which means that I guess it would be a kind of a hypothyroidism, and that hormone regulates cold and is affected by temperature and by light, and so yeah, that's also a possibility. But Cook, like many on board, with the absence of the sun for so long, came to revere the sun and attribute to it qualities that it may or may not have had. He thought that people were or that the sun was as essential to human well-being as it was to plants, and that there was some kind of human equivalent to photosynthesis, which now it turns out that psychiatrists have looked into this, and there is some truth to it. That the light photon traps in hemoglobin are actually structurally identical to the photon traps in chlorophyll, except in blood they're structured around an iron atom, and in chlorophyll they're structured around a magnesium atom. But I spoke to a psychiatrist who was fascinated by Cook, because Cook would have the men stand in front of a blazing fire as a substitute for sunlight, and that ended up being the first known instance of light therapy, which is used today commonly to treat seasonal affective disorder, among other forms of depression. And I spoke to a Yale psychiatrist who has studied Cook not just as some kook, but as a real, I guess, forebear, as a pioneer in phototherapy, and he believes that Cook was right on. Actually, his instinct that humans and plants have I guess some kind of connection in their ability to make the use of the sun's energy is, he thought Cook was ahead of his time there.
If I got it right from your book, it's there's no sun at all for what is it, 70 days?
70 days. There's a sort of a gloaming around noon, but the sun doesn't rise above the horizon. They weren't. They were around 70 degrees south, 70, 71, and so they would have had maybe a glimmer if it wasn't overcast. But it was extremely dark, and they fell into sort of a deep pit of despondency. And that the darkness also, I guess, had some effect on their mental instability. And as you say, before anybody else, before Danko, before everything else really it really got bad, the cat died. Another Nansen, the other one, he became hostile, irritable. He went and hid in the corners of the ship. He stopped chasing rats. And actually, I say he. It was a she. They all called her he, but it was. The zoologist makes it clear that it was she. But all the men ended up experiencing the same symptoms later on. So it was.
And some of them actually went. Well, I don't know if you'd say clinically insane. I don't know if that's a meaningful expression, but they went right over the edge.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that any psychologist would disagree that they went insane. One of them, after the return of the sun, when you would think that everything would start getting better, is actually when it started getting worse, because I guess they realized that they were still that the ice wasn't melting. They were still stuck there, and the sun was back, but they were still prisoners. So one of them, one morning, hands a note to his shipmate saying, "I can't hear, I can't speak, help." And the shipmate was alarmed and goes straight to Cook, who realizes that there's nothing wrong with this guy's ears or his vocal cords, but that it's a kind of a hysterical reaction. And he was acting erratically, but eventually his hearing and speech returned. But as soon as it did, what he used the speech for was to threaten to murder his immediate superior. And so he had to be watched 24/7. He was always a bit of a strange guy, but this also destabilized everybody on board. And then there was another case just a few months after that. A guy who went, was even more disturbing than the case I just mentioned. His name was Tollefson. Was stricken with acute paranoia. He first of all, he forgot how he had gotten to the Antarctic. He wasn't sure where he was or why. He thought he could walk back to Belgium. He was convinced that his shipmates wanted to murder him, and so he hid, poorly clothed. He would walk out on the ice with wearing almost nothing. He would hide in the bowels of the ship among the rats, and he would scrape the penguin skins with a knife, just sort of like looking off into space. What Antarctic psychologists now call the Antarctic stare, which is a sort of a 12-foot stare in a 10-foot room. And then every time he passed by somebody, he would bow his head down as if to receive the execution, the fatal blow. That was, and he never recovered his reason. He was committed to an insane asylum where he lived the rest of his very long life.
And yet, when the sun comes back, I got the impression, and maybe I've not got this quite right, but I got the impression that once again, Cook and Amundsen, they perked right back up again.
They do. Well, they were they had embarked upon what they call a partnership to perfect traveling polar equipment, traveling equipment techniques, igloo building. They dreamt of leading their own expeditions, and they recognized in each other, as I say, this sort of grand thinking, this a similar idea of the possible, and they had this cockamamie dream of creating a new ark to bring all the northern species to the south and vice versa to create some kind of ecodiversity. It was just nuts. But they were excited by where they were. Everybody else was just glum and couldn't even concentrate on a book or on their work or anything. And meanwhile, Cook and Amundsen are just talking through the night. And so they were invigorated by this. And after recovering from a near fatal disease, LeCointe joined them on some of their expeditions. And so he was in on their trio, and they actually had plans to, realizing that de Gerlache, who had himself planned to in a possible third year of campaign make the trip to the South Magnetic Pole. They realized that he was in no condition, that he was at death's door, and that they would do it themselves. And actually, the plan they put together, even though they didn't get a chance to actually execute it, was remarkably similar to the plan that Amundsen actually used to get to the South Pole in 1912.
Right, because Amundsen turns out to be one of the great polar explorers.
Yeah, his idea of himself was that imagining his destiny as a great polar explorer was right on. He had this goal, and he did everything. He had tunnel vision, absolutely, and so he became the explorer he dreamt of being. Which I don't know that many people can say that they became exactly what they dreamt of being, but he can.
I guess the reason that they never do manage to do that is that the ship just stays stuck, right?
No, the ice doesn't give up. As the sun returns at the height of summer, the ice is still not. The floe that contains the ship is showing no signs of shrinking. In fact, because the men had needed to create a kind of a casing of snow for insulation, it had thickened the ice at that point, and so they were stuck. No matter what happened to the floe, they were in trouble. And
but they had a brilliant idea, didn't they?
Did, yeah.
Because they brought tonite down with them, so no problem. We'll just blow it up.
Right, tonite, which is a cousin of dynamite, and was thought to have been more powerful, but just they thought, well, this is our insurance policy. We should at some point try and check out if it works. And this was still a few months from when they expected the ice to open up, but they were thinking maybe they can aid in the crack up of the ice by using explosives. They figured, the ice is no match for the tonite. And in fact, most of when they got down there, they realized that the heat of the tropics and the cold of the Antarctic had compromised a huge amount of the tonite, and the rats had gotten to some of it too. And so when they tried to use it, they were sourly disappointed by this sort of fizzling attempt. And the first few didn't blow up at all. The second two just basically looked like the kind of flares you see in a football game, and did nothing to break up the ice. Later, they realized that they needed to be thawed, and so LeCointe spent after handling these with kid gloves at first. He decided, okay, well, I'm just going to pack these into my bed and sleep next to them. And eventually, they did explode, but the sea ice is such that it's pretty elastic. It's flexible, it's much more so than freshwater ice. And so when they would plant these bundles of tonite into the ice and light them, they ran for cover. They thought that possibly it would shatter the whole pack, and in fact, it created a huge explosion, but maybe a hole maybe 3 feet in diameter, and or actually not even a hole at that point, just a sort of a sooty concavity, and that would quickly got filled up. So they realized that whatever they were going to do, the tonite wasn't going to be their salvation. Cook saw go ahead.
But as I understand it, at that stage, they'd more or less given up trying to get the ship out. They were just waiting for the ice to break and hoping it would, and it was now clear it wasn't going to.
Hoping it would, yeah.
And they were kind of resigned to this idea they were going to have to spend yet another year, where presumably that would kill off at least half of them.
Well, that's what Cook said. Cook was one of his great interventions was to take daily measurements, psychological surveys of the men, but also just taking their vitals every day. And he realized that half of the people there were bedridden. All of them or a good number of them were sick. And aside from a few exceptions, like probably himself and Amundsen and LeCointe, he thought that most people would not survive a second winter. And so he knew that the odds were against them, but he said, we need to try to break out of the ship. And at first the reaction was in the wardroom when he proposed it was uproarious laughter. Like, what do you think? What are you thinking? You might. It's like as if he'd suggested they flap their arms and fly home. And Cook, who's normally a very, even-keeled man, they saw him lose his cool for the first time. Then he said, well, if we do nothing, we're dying. So we're doing something. And he came up with a wild plan to dig trenches to the very bottom layer of ice along a line from the nose of the ship to the nearest body of water. And that would, in his mind, since he believed the sun was all powerful, it would allow the sun to heat the layer of water over the top, over the ice, and such that if the ice were starting to crack, it would most likely crack along that line, which would have been useful for the ship. He threw himself into this plan with verve, and nobody else really believed in it, but they did it to make him happy. But as they started doing it, they realized that just the very act, the physical act of shoveling, digging, and using pickaxes, it gave the men some measure of agency in their predicament, and that all of a sudden they were starting to feel better. They were starting to feel a modicum of hope, and even though it didn't work, it was dictated by poor physics. There was no way the water was going to that the sun was heating was going to stay above that ice along that line. It was just going to spread out over the flow. But it gave de Gerlache, all of a sudden, de Gerlache just wakes up and he realizes, this is my fault that everybody's here. This is my fault that Danko died. And this plan may not have worked, but I got the guys working together. I got the guys out of their beds. I got the guys eating again. I got the guys eating penguin. I got me eating penguin. And all of a sudden people are feeling better. Well, why don't we try something else, something even more ambitious, which is not to try to encourage the ice to melt along a line, but to actually saw a whole canal through that would allow the ship to exit.
And how long would the canal need to be?
It would have been 700 meters, but when you factor in the fact that they would have to saw two banks of ice that was at least 3 meters thick, or no, at least 1 meter thick, but in most places 3 meters thick, two banks, and then you have to section off all the different parts of the ice in between the sections of ice, and then move these out into a clearing of water. And then keep doing it. Every time it refreezes, you have to recut. So ultimately, they have to saw through a mile and a half of ice, which is insane to contemplate. And then some of these sections towards the mouth of the canal would have been the size of half a football field and way more than the ship.
And particularly given the state that they're in at this stage.
Yeah, they were weakened. They were husks of themselves. And then, but in that work, they saw they grew what called ponderous muscles. And they were eating 6 or 7 penguin steaks a day, and all of a sudden they're not healthy, but many of them get back to health. But de Gerlache remained sick for years after, but he persevered, which is, I think, to his credit, it's a pretty heroic thing for the captain to do, the commander.
They have terrible reverses, don't they, sawing this up, because they saw up the canal, and then almost the minute they've done it, the ice shifts and it all closes again, right?
Yeah, the pressures were such that it couldn't stand to have this vacuum there. It closed back up like the jaws of some animal, and so they had to keep sawing it. And it's Sisyphean battle against the pressures of the ice, and ultimately it did close. It closed back up, and at this point, the ship is in an even worse predicament than it had ever been, because as long as the ice was solid around it, it acted as a kind of a buffer. Yes, it could. And it threatened to crush the ship, but that's much more of a danger when the ice can build some momentum and actually it clamp shut like a vice.
And then once it just in sort of a freak turn of the current or the wind, it kind of opens up a little bit.
Yeah.
Then they're still stuck because the ice around the ship is, I don't know how thick it was, but it's really thick, right? And there's no way they can saw that.
Oh, it's like 26 feet thick. I mean, yeah. And so that's when they realized, well, we've done a few unpromising experiments with the tonite. We know it's extremely powerful if done right, but we also have no way to calibrate it. So they did their best. Lecointe, as I said, was a mathematical prodigy. He calculated as best he could to try to get the tonite close enough to the ship without destroying their only way out. And he, wedged them into the ice, lit them, and prayed. They all prayed, and all the windows shattered. But but ultimately the ice blew sky high. But the ship was fine. It was still able to wiggle out.
And again, this is where de Gerlache is very impressive, because they're still basically stuck. And he has to navigate them out of the ice pack. Yeah. And the way you described it in the book anyway, it was a pretty phenomenal act of seamanship to
It
get them
was,
free.
yeah. Yeah, he came back alive after, when he was stuck in the ice, it was as if his life's work was, or his mission in life was taken away from him. He was no longer in command of the ship, the ice was. And so he felt despondent, he felt useless, he was depressed, but all of a sudden they're out navigating through a labyrinth of ice. Yes, the ice keeps on closing in on them, but he was awakened by the successful breakout from that flow, and he becomes his daring self again, and manages to slalom between the icebergs and break out in quite heroic fashion.
And he's also slightly vindicated, maybe I say that in a slightly cynical way, in
Yeah.
that when he gets back to Belgium,
Yeah,
the fact that they've wintered over this period and nobody knows where he is,
yeah,
and they think they're all probably dead,
yeah.
the celebrations and the honor and respect he's paid are to some extent proportional to the suffering they've gone through, perhaps
Yeah.
even more than the scientific discoveries.
Yeah, his gamble paid off. It turns out that they didn't care one lick about the South Magnetic Pole. They cared about the great story that came from that from that mission. And Dizerlash knew that was one of the considerations, is that in the field of exploration, good stories are probably the most precious resource that you can bring home. That's what Shackleton didn't achieve his mission. He got close, but he didn't get to the South Pole. And in the 1914 expedition, he's considered a hero because he brought all of his men home. Which
Right, and that extraordinary sort of journey across the open water.
yeah, I mean, it's tremendously heroic, and he deserves all the credit that history has given him. But his aims weren't achieved. It was seen as a survival story and as a celebration of the human spirit, and to an extent, so was the Belgica.
And so maybe we can turn now to Cook, because he's a true hero of the Belgica. I think probably the greatest hero of that voyage.
I saw him that way, yeah.
It came across in the book, but I found that convincing, certainly. But then he tries to be the hero in sort of two more stories, and three more stories, I suppose. So do you want to just say what happens to Cook after the Belgica?
After returning, he wrote his book, as I mentioned, that turned him into a minor celebrity, his narrative of the Belgica. And then his next mission was to summit Denali, or then known as Mount McKinley, the highest peak in North America, and which is in Alaska. And he, the first year he attempted it, he sort of circumnavigated the mountain, and which is a feat in itself. It had never been done, as far as anyone knew. Maybe it's possible that the local populations had done it, but nobody knew of anyone who had ever done it. And the second year he goes back and he realizes, well, that didn't make me famous. I really do need to get to the top of that, because he was living off the sales of his books. That's one of the problems of exploration, is that you sell sensationalism rather than, at least at that time, and I'm sure there's an element of that now.
Well, I suppose now you might be employed by an institution, but somebody like Cook would perhaps not be able to find an institution to support him.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the second year he goes back to McKinley, and then he writes a book about how he had successfully summited the mountain, and it's called At the Top of the Continent, another bestseller. Then he returned. Then in 1909, people hadn't heard from him in years. He announces to the Herald that he had reached the North Pole, and he was celebrated around the world, especially in his hometown of New York. And just a few weeks later, it was suggested that he had fabricated the accomplishment. And to this day, it's pretty convincing. There has not been a convincing case for Cook. In fact, the counter evidence is pretty compelling. So I think he didn't make it.
And is the belief that he himself knew he didn't make it, but he needed the story to be true because that's how he would keep income going or keep his name alive or whatever he was trying to get?
I would have to think that that's true, but there's an element of him, maybe not. His North Pole expedition was harrowing by every account, he spent a year in surviving on polar bear with two young Inuit men, and he did suffer a lot, and he did it was a tremendously impressive voyage. But I think so. He may have thought that, well, I'm close, and this is an ocean of ice. There's no way to tell. His sextant measurements were never found, and such measurements that were found were not conclusive. And so it's impossible to go into somebody's head like this, because he stuck to his claim for the rest of his life. But if he did make it up, it could be that he just thought, well, I'm not going to check. I feel like I'm here, It could have been something like that, but in any case, after that his reputation was shot, and people revisited his previous claim to have summited Denali, and his rival and also fellow claimant to the North Pole Prize, Robert Peary, had gotten one of Cook's mountain guides to Denali to admit that they had lied about it. That the photograph taken of Cook on the peak of Denali was actually from a much lower promontory. So after this, Cook's reputation is shot. The only audiences he can get are in the vaudeville stage. He becomes a bit of a national punchline, and he tries to reinvent himself as an oil man in the Texas oil fields, and actually makes quite a killing by I guess collecting. It reminds me of the subprime mortgage crisis. He collects a bunch of distressed and actually unproductive oil plots of land, unproductive oil wells, and figures that, well, if I get a lot of them together, then something will happen, that somehow that it's going to be more valuable than the sum of its parts. And trading on his notoriety, he gets a lot of people to sign on as shareholders, and then it pays their dividends by sales of further stock. So it's a pyramid scheme in effect, and also he was lying about the profits that they could expect. So he was prosecuted and condemned and sentenced to 14 years in Leavenworth prison, which was a particularly harsh sentence for similar crimes. There was a lot of swindlers out there, and Cook got the book thrown at him.
Presumably Cook gets punished for his claims for the North Pole, and gets punished for being famous, or gets punished for having a bad reputation.
I think so, and that's supported by the statement of the judge upon sentencing him, calling him the Machiavelli of the 20th century, and that he can no longer bunco anyone, they said. And so he ends up being the most popular man in Leavenworth, and he's just as he was the most popular man in the Belgica. And actually, he was at his best when he had people to take care of, and he found that his fellow inmates were suffering from similar ailments to his shipmates on the Belgica. It was the food was terrible, and he recognized the signs of scurvy as well. He recognized the lack of sunlight made men depressed. The imprisonment, I mean, they were, it's another kind of prison. He also realized that the cerebral symptoms, and he was the physician's assistant in Leavenworth. So he prescribed sunlight, fresh meat, just as he had in the Belgica, and who knows? Maybe he saved some lives as well. But I found that to be touching as well. And the one man who visited him in jail, the one man he would allow to visit him, was Roald Amundsen.
I thought it spoke very well of Amundsen that he would be willing to come to see Cook, because perhaps some of the notoriety might rub off on Amundsen. So I thought that was terrific.
Yeah, and it actually, he knew that it would maybe reflect poorly on him, but he loyalty was the paramount virtue for him, and he credited Cook for saving his life. And even as he had turned his back on everybody else at the end of his life, and made enemies of everybody who either had crossed or had helped him, he never turned his back on Cook. So that friendship anchors the book.
Okay, well, I think we've got to a natural end there, have we?
Yeah. Yeah,
That's a great story. That is such a good story. It's amazing how it all locks together.
yeah.
That friendship between Cook and Amundsen, just remarkable, remarkable men.
I just found that, for me, it was just this idea that the hero and the anti-hero are so intertwined, that their lives are so intertwined, and that they could have seen each other as rivals, and maybe they did to some extent, but it's the bond that was born on that mountainside when they were roped together. It was just sort of never undone.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Julian.
Oh, this was a pleasure. I really appreciate it, and I'll be thinking of you during the match tonight.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
All right.
Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media, and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.